The geopolitical landscape has taken an unexpected turn as four major powers, China, Iran, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, have collectively imposed sanctions against the United States and Israel. This alliance between these disparate nations has sent shockwaves through the international community. According to geopolitical Lutz Kleveman in his book, The New Great Game, gone are the days when clear ideological lines divided global powers into binary camps. More fluid partnerships and networks of cooperation are replacing old bloc mentalities. This breakdown of static alignments is accelerating in the aftermath of COVID-induced disruptions that exacerbated tensions between major economies. Take the US-China relationship as a prime example. What was once mutually beneficial interdependency has given way to distrust and calls for decoupling. Rising nationalism, coupled with trade and tech tensions, have led both nations to view each other more as civilizational rivals today, compared to partners just a decade ago. Against this backdrop, the rationale for China seeking new global allies, even with historical competitors like Iran, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, becomes clearer. They have a common impetus to counterbalance America's dominance across economic, technological, and military domains. The seeds of this counter-alliance have already been sown in recent times. China has made significant inroads into the GCC region that houses some of the world's largest oil and gas reserves, while also boasting trillions in sovereign wealth funds. Let's analyze how Beijing's relationships with critical players, Saudi Arabia and UAE, have evolved to understand why joint sanctions could be plausible. For decades, Saudi-China bilateral ties were anchored in oil trade. China relies heavily on Saudi crude imports, with over 15% of its needs coming from the kingdom. But in the last decade, signs of a deeper partnership have emerged as both countries eye long-term strategic benefits. In fact, despite historical political differences, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has visited China multiple times since 2016 and hosted Chinese President Xi Jinping in Saudi in 2019, as this Al Jazeera documentary shows. This flurry of high-profile diplomatic activity between Arabian and Chinese leadership is an unprecedented development, pointing to fast converging interests. These interests span well beyond hydrocarbon trade, as highlighted in this Wall Street Journal report. As Saudi ties with the West struggle post-Khashoggi, Riyadh sees its relationship with China as too indispensable to not cultivate. Why does this alliance make sense for both countries? Benefits for Saudis from Chinese partnership. 1. Access to technology. Becoming a lead investor in Saudi's futuristic Neom City project, which also houses Aramco oil infrastructure. 2. Defense capabilities. Joint ventures with Chinese defense firms to acquire sophisticated weaponry and surveillance tools. 3. Regional clout. China's backing helps Saudi's geopolitical power and counteracts threats like Iran. China's incentives for strong Gulf foothold. 1. Energy security. 2. Infrastructure projects worth billions. 3. Strategic foothold in West Asia. China's relations firming up with the UAE too. Alongside the Saudis, China has also been wooing regional heavyweight UAE through multi-billion-dollar investments under the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, spanning ports, 5G networks, etc. As this report from CGTN illustrates, the UAE and more broadly GCC region figures prominently in China's ambition to revive ancient Silk Road trade routes via a transcontinental connectivity corridor. The deepening China-UAE bilateral ties also gel neatly with joint sanction ambitions, as UAE remains a crucial OPEC player that can roil markets. While strengthening Arab relations remains vital, China is also strategically embracing a partnership with Saudi's arch-nemesis Iran. In 2021, China and Iran entered a 25-year cooperation agreement spanning energy, security, infrastructure, and banking. Under the terms, China will invest close to $400 billion into developing Iran's oil and gas sector, petrochemical facilities, and transport networks. In return, Iran will supply China with crude oil at discounted rates. But this pact is about more than just fossil fuels, as explained by Professor of Political Science at Tehran University, Dr. Majid Rahnama in this DW interview. This sweeping partnership represents two ancient civilizations and emerging powers coming together to challenge the superpower status quo. For Iran, China is an ideal ally to alleviate economic paralysis resulting from harsh US sanctions tied to its nuclear program. Both nations share hostility towards America's strategic positioning in Asia and the Middle East. Meanwhile, China gains a valuable beachhead into West Asia's complex geopolitics. While the China nexus is most prominent in this realignment wave, one cannot ignore Russia's movements in this theater. Despite historic ties with India, Russia has warmed up considerably to China, and even Iran in recent years within joint forums like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO. They have conducted joint military exercises while pursuing energy cooperation, as discussed in this Economist report. With the West turning increasingly hostile, Putin sees greater long-term interest aligning with China's ambitions, even if it plays second fiddle in that dynamic. Bringing the analysis together so far, China has rapidly built robust economic and diplomatic linkages within the region, spanning former US partners like Saudi Arabia and rivals like Iran. Russia is also bolstering engagement, sensing global power dynamics in flux. All four nations hold a shared desire to erode America's strategic clout, whether in trade flows, petropolitics, or security architectures. This is where coordinated sanctions emerge as a formidable weapon to disrupt America's global standing. Before covering possible repercussions, let's briefly summarize why this move would absolutely destroy US markets. 1. China, as the largest holder of US Treasury securities with over $1 trillion, has the power to trigger financial contagion. 2. Saudi Arabia, as the de facto leader of OPEC, controls the world's main swing producer of oil with the ability to raise prices. 3. Russia, already weaponized its sizable energy exports to Europe as coercive leverage. 4. Iran, sitting by the Strait of Hormuz choke point. It frequently threatens to block 30% of seaborne oil traffic. Using their respective trump cards, joint sanctions could have catastrophic impacts on America's economic backbone spanning energy, financial, and commodities markets. Let's game out various scenarios, starting with China, dumping its huge hoard of US government debt. This would severely inhibit Washington's ability to fund programs and manage its $31 trillion debt burden. A sudden Chinese fire sale of US treasuries could lead to massive capital flight, given how deeply America relies on foreign borrowing. If Saudi Arabia also coordinates with production cuts, the impact gets amplified further via inflationary pressures as businesses and consumers alike buckle under higher fuel and material costs. Over the medium term, prolonged sanctions could thrust America into an economic death spiral, featuring a vicious cycle of rising interest rates, plunging markets, and vanishing liquidity. Energy shortfalls would also trigger painful industrial shutdowns. As economist Dr. Carmen Reinhart told Bloomberg in an interview, sanctions of this scale could severely undermine investor confidence in US markets, provoking capital flight and even recession. Apart from immediate economic tribulations, this realignment also leaves US national security vulnerable. Its strategic supremacy hinges on the primacy of the US dollar and the attractiveness of American financial markets to raise capital globally. With sanctions eroding both, Washington loses valuable tools like unilateral secondary sanctions that grant it influence far beyond borders. Thus far, we have discussed mainly the monetary perils facing America in this scenario, but intense geopolitical tremors would also emanate from such a radical realignment, forcing allies to pick sides. Firstly, the imposition of sanctions directly by major economies like China, Russia, and Saudi-led OPEC would shatter perceptions of US dominance even among wavering Western partners. Much of America's global sway stems from the magnetic pull of its mighty economy and markets. With that allure gone, scores of nations reorient their priorities. This would place European powers like Germany and France in a tight spot, compelled to select between economic ties with the giant Chinese and Russian markets or falling in line behind US sanctions. Most EU nations already deepened linkages over the last decade with both Beijing and Moscow across infrastructure, technology, and energy domains. Jeopardizing this would inflict notable harm. Nowhere would the tremors be most violently felt beyond the economy than in the Middle East. An explicit pivot by Arab heavyweights like the Saudis into China's strategic orbit has numerous consequences. It gives Iran more leeway to accelerate its nuclear enrichment program and cross past red lines with American threats now toothless. Saudi Arabia can also go on an offensive against regional rivals no longer restrained by US calls urging constraint. This fuels further disorder. The fallout also spills over into South Asia, with India under extra pressure from Moscow and Beijing's combined weight against its interests. The only silver lining is Pakistan is equally stripped of its China crutch. Stepping back, the overarching conclusion is stark for Washington. Its post-WW2 liberal order, anchored by institutions like the UN, World Bank, and IMF, suffers enormous blows to legitimacy. In its place rises parallel China-centric structures like the AIIB and BRICS Bank that offer alternate platforms for nations disaffected by Western hypocrisy on issues from human rights to the environment. The era of uncontested American hegemony that defined much of the past century stands buried by this realigned configuration. What we've highlighted today is no longer an implausible scenario, but almost an inevitability given the course set. Global power rebalancing is firmly underway, accelerated by perceptions of Western decline. While many factors would still need to perfectly coalesce for joint sanctions to materialize, the risks can no longer be casually dismissed as tensions rise. America and its traditional allies like the EU and India face turmoil in navigating this unfamiliar terrain.